All right. Well, we're still missing a couple. Hopefully, they will catch up with us here. Welcome to week 5. Believe it or not, at some point in this week basically marks the 1/3 point of the course, since we've got roughly 15 weeks in the class. So, what the main, I guess, theme for tonight is starting to transition from sort of initial game ideas and sort of the instructional design side of things, where we're trying to identify an educational problem, we are analyzing the students, and then coming up with some instructional goals, really no different from anything that we would do for any lesson plan or lesson activity in the classroom. But where tonight will start to differ is that with tonight, we're going to start now looking at the design and planning phase of the actual games. So right now, as they exist, the games are really just, I'm going to create a game that will help me solve this problem in the classroom, but we don't really know much yet about the specifics of that, what kind of a game it is, how it's going to be played, what kind of stuff we're going to need to play the game, what the rules are, and all that sort of stuff. So that's what starts tonight, and will start carrying through the next several weeks as the actual games get going. If you remember our definition of a game, the game itself is actually the set of rules. That is what actually constitutes the game, is the set of rules. Everything else, the boards and the dice and the cards and the scratch projects and all of that, are just there to support the playing of the game. So we will be definitely focusing initially on that piece of it, on the rules development, and sort of what type of a game we're looking to create. So we're going to cover those two main topics tonight. But before we get into that part of it, as always, I just want to give a bit of an open forum here in case anybody has questions from the first 4 weeks of the class. We've done 2 weeks of scratch work, couple of mini projects in the mix there. We've spent a couple of weeks just talking about the instructional design and sort of initial idea phase of our game projects. So is there anything at this point on either of those fronts, or honestly on anything else related to the class, that anyone would like to bring up? Abby, I see a hand up there. Go ahead.
This is just a really quick question. So the wiki that we've been working on with the analysis questions and the game elements and all that kind of stuff, like we've worked on it and we've filled in the questions, but are those things set in stone or can we adjust them as we go along?
They can absolutely be adjusted. I mean, at this point, the only things that there's an expectation are filled in are just the problem, the audience analysis, and the instructional goals for the game.
Okay.
But even those can change. I mean, this is an artistic, a creative act, and as I always try to hammer home to my students in my songwriting classes and my music composition classes, like, I will never tell them they can't go back and rethink a decision that they made earlier on in the process. Things will develop. You will see different, see your game in different perspectives as you go, and you may come across things as you go. So absolutely, and that's part of why I wanted to leave it as sort of that online wiki, is so that you could constantly update it. And then if I'm checking in on it, I get to see whatever the most current version is without having to have you resubmit paperwork to me and stuff like that. So that wiki will be kind of a living document as we go through this game development.
Thank you so much.
Yep, no problem. Other questions before we dive in here? All right. Well, let me bop over here to some sharing of our Blackboard. Um, in terms of the overview for the week, it's pretty straightforward. As I said, we're going to kind of divide tonight into two subtopics. One is going to be just kind of looking at some of the terminology related to the kinds of games that you can create. And specifically, I want to make sure that we go through and kind of understand how some of these game type decisions might impact the educational experience, because that's sort of what's key here. If we were just creating a game to create a game, we could kind of do whatever kind of game we want as long as it was fun. But being teachers and the fact that we are our audience, our students, there are some things that we're going to want to keep in mind that might lead us towards one type of game over another type of game. So we're going to look at that, and then the main thing is the rules, and really along with the rules is the flow chart. Your rules and your flow chart, you're going to be developing kind of side by side, hand in hand, because the one really helps to cross check the other. So if you just develop the rules with no flow chart, then there may be holes in the rules that you're not aware of. But on the same time, it's kind of hard to build a flow chart without really understanding what kind of rules you're looking to lay out. So generally, this process of the rules and the flow chart sort of happen along the same time with each other. As you adjust one, you adjust the other. As you find out one piece of information from one, you use it to make changes to the other. So we're going to look at those two things. I do want to point out right now, and I may mention this at the end of the class too, but in 2 weeks, so next week will be the third and last of our scratch weeks. The week after is what I call the alpha testing of your game. You've probably heard of beta testing. Alpha testing really is just when you're getting feedback on just the initial ideas for the game. So the expectation is not in 2 weeks that you have rules and boards and cards and dice and everything is ready to play. In 2 weeks, it's really going to be just going over in small groups what the topic of your game is, what the goals are you're trying to achieve with the game, and in a very rough way, what kind of game you think you're going to be making. Maybe a little bit if you have some rough ideas of the type of gameplay or sort of roughly what will happen in the game. But the expectation is not that you're bringing in completed game rules in 2 weeks. So it's a chance to get some early feedback before you go too far down the road of really getting into the nitty gritty of the rules and everything like that. So just a chance to bounce your concept and your initial thoughts on the game past a couple of people. What I usually try to do with that alpha testing, we'll be doing that in small groups, probably breakout groups, is be looking at sort of the topics of games. And if there's some obvious groupings where we have 2 or 3 people or 4 people working on similar types of topics for their games, then I usually try to group those people together, just because it's more likely that you're going to be kind of working through the same issues with the subject that you've picked. But again, that's in 2 weeks, not next week. In 2 weeks, we'll have that as our main activity. All right, so let me bounce over here now to the first of these pages for tonight, which is about sort of game types. Um, and this is not an exhaustive list. If I have friends who are actually do game development for a living, and I'm sure they would look at this list and kind of laugh at it in terms of how simple it is and so on. But this is largely about instruction and education. This is not, you're all not here to become, game designers and so on. But so I just want to hit some of kind of the top level considerations when you're creating a game, of things to kind of keep in mind. So the first one is maybe the most obvious, which is the game delivery mode. And I think I've even talked about this already. This is the thing you think of when you categorize games. It's a board game, it's a card game, it's a dice game, it's a video game, it's a role playing game, it's a strategy game. So it kind of is mainly the sort of the physical way that the game is going to be played. So board, card, dice, video, etc. Um, Obviously, many games are going to incorporate many different things. I mean, for example, like a game Monopoly, right? So Monopoly is basically a board game, but there are cards that are used in the game, and you roll dice in order to move your players around the board. So you might say, well, wait a minute, it's a board game and a card game and a dice game kind of all in one. But I think if you think about it, obviously that game is primarily a board game. The other elements are just there to support the gameplay and to kind of help it along. But, the cards are not the game. They are just an aspect of how it's played. The main sort of playing arena is the actual board that the game is played on. So, and I'm not going to get too nitpicky about this, but you should think about kind of what direction, what type of game, because that's going to obviously then influence the physical things that you need to create for the game. So if you happen to be, working in a group, or you are somebody that has, let's say, a certain level of artistic ability, then you might be looking to do something that's more visual and more kind of a board game where things are laid out, or cards that have nice designs to them. If you're not somebody like that, like me, then you may be looking to do something that's a little more straightforward, or maybe relies more on, dice or things like that. In terms of classroom considerations, just some things to think about for this is, different types of games are going to have different levels of playability depending on your age group of student, and depending on kind of the abilities of your students. So, it may be difficult for some students to, say, manipulate dice or manipulate cards. I remember very clearly my parents, for some reason, taught my sister and I to play bridge at a pretty early age. And I remember struggling to be able to hold 13 cards in my hand and be able to look at them all and kind of know what's going on. So I know that sounds like a minor consideration, but you want this experience to be positive for your students. You want them to learn something from it. You want them to get something out of it. And anything that's going to detract from the positive experience is going to get in the way of that. So you might want to just think a little bit about the abilities of your students, that what age they're at, and what they might respond better to. Visual games like Shoots and Ladders and Candyland are very accessible to young children because they're very graphic and very visual on the board. Whereas you think about a card game or something like that, it's a little more abstract, and they have to understand what the cards mean and so on. So just think about that. And then, just in terms of practical consideration, if you're making a board game in a typical classroom setting, is there going to be space to do that? Um, if there's lots of little parts to the game, are they likely to get lost? Again, depending on your age group. So these are kinds of practical considerations that you might want to keep in mind when you think about what type of game and what kind of physical elements you're going to be incorporating into that game. Um, but I think, other than that, the game delivery mode is probably the most straightforward of these things. In terms of our game definition, competitive agents, the competing agents, obviously this is something you are also going to want to think about pretty early on, because you are going to have either a variation of people versus people, which could be a person versus a person, or a group of people versus a group of people, or it's going to be the game rules versus a person or a group of people. And obviously that difference is going to make big impact on the rules that you're creating and so on, because playing a game against a set of rules is going to take you down a very different path than if you're playing where it's people playing versus people. So you're going to want to kind of think through the outcomes of that choice. And one thing I always like to bring up at this point, and we touched on it a little bit when we were talking about um, education versus gaming, is that, at least to my mind, this competitive agents piece is one of the potential pitfalls for bringing games into a classroom. To simplify the argument, in a classroom, you are generally trying to foster a group environment where people are supporting each other, where they're helping each other out, where they're lifting each other up. And on the other side, a typical game is winners and losers. And obviously, certain groups of students are going to be able to handle that totally fine. And especially if, like, the stakes of the game are really not that critical, it may not matter. But you've all probably worked with students at some point where they just have a hard time dealing with the fact that they've lost something, or somebody who wins something then feels like they are somehow better than the people that lost that thing. So this will be one place where, if we were just creating a game, we'd probably be fine putting person versus person. In a classroom, if you're going to do that, just carefully think through the possible sort of outcomes, and how can you structure it in a way that everyone will come out of the game feeling supported, feeling like they had a good time, and more importantly, that everybody learned whatever the thing was that was trying to be learned. Because that's another pitfall. If somebody loses the game, does that mean they somehow got a lesser experience that impacted the learning of the game, and so on? So again, think through what direction you want to take that in, because that will impact rule decisions and other game decisions and so on. Um, but and then just think about how you're going to work the competitive piece into a classroom situation where it won't become, it won't subtract from the classroom experience. All right. So game delivery mode, competitive agents. Any questions so far? All right. The next two go about as far into sort of game development theory as we're going to get for this course. And that has to do with informational style and developmental style for the game. So the first one, informational style, this has to do with, I guess the easiest way to say it is, at at any point in the game. So imagine you're playing the game, pick a random point of the game. At that point in the game, does everybody who's playing the game know sort of the entire condition of the game at that moment? Like, do they know where every piece is, where every card is, what every bit of information for the game is? Or is it a game where at any given moment there are certain sort of states of the game that certain players do not know the condition of? Probably the clearest example of this would be, say, chess on one hand, right? When you play chess, both players know the position of every piece. They know the entire board. They know what pieces have been captured. They know where every piece is on the board. They know every move that each other has made. So there is absolutely nothing hidden. The only potentially hidden thing is just what each of the players is thinking in their minds about their next moves. But that's just strategy. That's not the condition of the game. So that would be considered a perfect style game, perfect informational style. Everybody knows everything all the time. Imperfect games are then the opposite. So to go back to an example I was just using, Monopoly, right? So yeah, at any given point in the game, you know where your player is, you know where the other player's tokens are, you know which properties have houses and hotels on them, but you don't know that for the cards. There's chance cards, there's the community chest cards. Um, you don't know how much money each player has. If you play it the game the official way, You are not supposed to know how much money each player has, so you don't know what kind of decisions they're going to make there. So in that type of a game, at any given moment, some people don't know what some of the information on the game is. So in that case, they're having to make decisions based on incomplete information or guesses. Poker is another great example of an imperfect game, right? You know what you have in your hand, you know what's down on the table, but you have no idea what's in the other player's hands. So the best you can do is kind of infer and guess and kind of do what you can to figure that information out. So the thing about this is not neither one of them is better or worse than the other. They are just two different approaches to games. I mean, obviously chess is one of the most played games in the world and one of the most highly respected games in the world, and it is a perfect game. And there are also thousands and thousands of people that play poker, and that is also a perfectly acceptable game. And they are both examples of one or the other. Um, the one thing I will say, though, in relationship to our definition of a game, is that the imperfect games can be a little easier to incorporate um, meaningfully ambiguous decisions into. It's a little harder to set up a game where decisions are truly ambiguous if everybody knows everything about the state of the game. I mean, I guess if you really took this to an extreme, you might make an argument that chess isn't actually a game because a good player, well, no, that wouldn't work out. I was going to say a good player can kind of project every possible strategy moving forward from wherever the pieces are. But even there, you have no idea what the other player is going to do. So, for practical purposes, yeah, those are meaningfully ambiguous decisions. But if a game has a deck of cards that are shuffled and that's a part of the gameplay, then right off the bat, if that's part of the game, players aren't going to know when they make a certain decision what the next card is they're going to draw. And that card may change whether the decision they made was better or worse for the outcome of the game. Um, so, just generally speaking, imperfect games may have a bit of an advantage when it comes to those meaningfully ambiguous decisions. But that's not to say that you can't get those decisions into perfect style games. But just something to think about as you're starting into this process. If you want to make it maybe a little easier on yourself, then you may be looking to create a game that not everybody knows everything about the game at any given moment. All right. The other piece of that is the developmental style. And this has to do more with like the gameplay itself. So the two types are progressive and repetitive. And I'll actually start with the repetitive one because that's a little easier. In a repetitive game, every turn in the game is operating under the same rules, basically. So to go back to the example I was just using, chess, right? Chess, every turn, every piece can move the same way. It's not like early in the game, pieces can move two spaces, and then other times in the game, they can only move one. Although I just realized I contradicted that because it is true in chess. The first time a pawn moves, it can move two. After that, it can only move one. So maybe there's a little bit of progressiveness in there. But basically, repetitive games are just where when every player plays their turn, they're basically going through the same process as every other player, and it continues that way till you get to the end of the game. A game like um, Life, if you know that game, that would be a bit more of a progressive game because that game has sort of three distinct phases to it. The opening phase is all about like going to college and picking a job and sort of those beginning, early in life things. And then you go through the part of the game where you're kind of going through life. And then you cross over a bridge, and the last chunk of the game sort of operates differently because your goal there is to try to finish out and so on. So, in a game like that, where it kind of progresses through phases, um, the rules basically are kind of changing, or at least how what the players are trying to achieve on each turn changes as the game progresses. So that's what the progressive is. The repetitive is basically when everything just stays the same. Um, the main effect here, and in terms of thinking about your students, is that repetitive games, generally speaking, are um, what I'm trying to say. Repetitive games are easier. They're more straightforward. If you're trying to teach a game to a group of students, repetitive games, because they tend to just have one set of rules that just repeats over and over and over again, that generally is easier to get across to a group of students or to a group of people who have not played it. Um, and generally, they're just easier to play. The progressive games, by their nature, are generally a little more involved, a little more complicated. If you're trying to fit a game into a class period, you might find that trying to get through a progressive styled game may just take too long if you don't have the time to do it. Sometimes repetitive games are easier to kind of bring to a stop because you don't have to make it through phases of the game to finish it. You can just kind of set a condition and kind of finish the game there. I mean, many of you have probably had the experience of playing a game and the official rules say like play until what player has won 7 hands, and you're playing along and you're like, you know what, it's getting late, let's just play whoever wins the next hand wins the game, right? So repetitive games are a lot easier to kind of modify like that and close out in terms of that. So again, know your audience. Think about how will they respond to a game. If you're thinking of doing a progressive game, how do you think your students will respond to that? Do you think you'll be able to explain the game easily and in a straightforward way where they will understand it? Or is it better to just kind of go with a repetitive style where once they get going, they just kind of get into the rhythm of the game? So that'll be one other thing to think about. Um, any questions on either of those two, informational or developmental style? All right. The last two here, I'm not really going to say much about because we've already covered them, and they just are going back to our game definition, and that's the meaningfully ambiguous decisions and the end game. Um, and in terms of the meaningfully ambiguous, because we're kind of couching this in terms of instructional impact, I've already had a couple of discussions with a couple of people about game ideas, and one of the challenges with meaningfully ambiguous decisions can be, as a teacher, one of your natural go-tos when you think of game is like, well, I'm going to use this to reinforce some skill that we've done in class, right? I'm going to have them use this to practice multiplication tables or something like that. The problem is that that can very easily lead you to something that is more of just either a contest or more of a puzzle, in that there's one right answer and really you're just boiling it down to who answers the most correctly. Like that's a contest, that's not a decision they're making. So if that's the kind of thing you want to do in the game where they are practicing answering equations or something like that, or vocabulary definitions or matching words up, like something where there's just a right answer and really it's just did they get the right answer or not, you can look outside of that to put in the meaningfully ambiguous. The meaningfully ambiguous don't have to necessarily be about your goal. So in other words, they maybe you have them solving equations, but if you think about like Jeopardy, if you were just doing a trivia game with Jeopardy, it would probably not be a game because there's a right answer to each question and it's just about who answers it first. But if you think about what they did in Jeopardy is they make each question have a dollar value. And all of a sudden now there is meaningfully ambiguous decisions. They don't really relate to the right answer. It doesn't change what the answer is. they're still having to answer the question correctly, but they have to strategize. Is it better for me to try to go for a harder question I may not be able to answer, but the payout would be more money? Or do I just go for easier questions, which I can maybe get more of? Is that a better way to win the game? So you can, if you're struggling with, I really want them to sort of practice a skill, but that doesn't really involve meaningfully ambiguous decisions. Maybe look outside of that skill and see if you can just build something into the gameplay that adds the meaningfully ambiguous piece, even if that's not directly the learning goal. Does that make sense? Since we're sort of talking about the impact of this stuff on the game, on the instructional piece of the game. So again, a couple people have already come to me with some ideas, and this has been one thing I've already commented on a couple of times is, that what you've described right now as it stands looks more like a contest or a puzzle. You can keep that idea, but see if you can add a layer around that that might add in that meaningfully ambiguous piece. And then that'll help the activity from being just sort of a rote, just spitting out right answers, and actually turn it into something engaging like a game. They'll have to strategize it. Um, and then while we're on the topic, end game, we all know what the end game is about, but think about in terms of the educational setting, just as you're building this game, kind of say to yourself, okay, this would be normally played in a single class period. Class periods for these students are usually 40 minutes long. If I'm going to have to explain the game and then get the game laid out for them, I may only have, 20 minutes left or 25 minutes left. Just make sure that when you're building your end game, that you're taking into account that this is probably being played in a classroom, and there's probably some constraints in terms of like when the activity would need to wrap up. It can be kind of difficult in a classroom to come back to a game the next day. So, just think about that. Maybe you want to make the game in a way where the end game is a little flexible. So if the teacher looks at the clock and it's starting to run short on time, there's a built-in way to bring the game to a close, or something along those lines. So the theme of all of this discussion is to let you know about some of the things that you're going to want to think about as you start designing your game, and alongside that, how these decisions could potentially impact the instructional experience of it, and just making sure that as you're building your game, you are making it a true game, but at the same time making it something that is going to work with your audience, and be something that they can access and use and have fun with. All right. Any last thoughts before I kind of flip over to the other main idea for the evening? All right. Well, I'm just going to keep rolling here then, and flip over to starting to talk about the actual development of your game rules and this idea of the flow chart. So, I think I've introduced this a couple of times now, so many of you probably are already kind of seeing where this is going. But the point of a flow chart in this case is basically error checking, is bug checking. So in a game that has a well-written set of rules, there should never be a moment in the game where the players are left wondering what they should do next. Right? Maybe they are, but they should be able to find that answer in your rules. So they get to a point in a game and they're like, oh, well, what happens now? Like, what are we supposed to do now? Or how does the game continue from here? They should be able to pick up the rules, look through it, and go, oh, here we are. So now so and so, you're supposed to do this, and then pick up one of those, and then it moves on to the next player, or something along those lines. With just the rules and just you thinking through the rules, it can be really easy to overlook potential dead ends in your gameplay, especially if you're the designer of the game, because your brain is going to automatically make the right choices in relationship to the game. Whereas the minute you put that game in front of a bunch of students, they are going to immediately discover the one part of the game where they're going to work themselves into a dead end and there's no way to work themselves out of it. That's just the nature of beta testing something, is they will find the one thing that you overlooked and didn't think. You were like, "Oh, I didn't think that that could happen in the game." So that's where the flowchart becomes your friend. Because if you accurately flowchart out your game, you should visually be able to see the entire game loop, the entire game play, and the only dead end should be your end game. Everything else, every other point in the game should be leading to something else, leading to the next thing. The only place you should have a dead end is whatever condition ends the actual game. So if you're developing the rules and putting a flowchart next to them and building them together, you'll very quickly start to see, oh, somebody could get to this point, ask this question, and I haven't thought what happens next. So that's your clue to then put in a rule or change the existing rules in such a way so that that dead end can't happen. Because nothing will shut down your students' educational experience more than getting halfway through a game and then realizing they can't continue the game because the rules don't make sense anymore, or they've somehow gotten out of the game loop. So, as a way to kind of demonstrate this, I picked a fairly well-known card game. I have come to learn over the years that not everybody knows Uno, but it does seem to be a pretty well-known card game, and there's lots of variations of it. But essentially, Uno, if you don't know, is a card game that is based on matching. So every player has a certain number of cards in their hand. There's a pile of cards in the middle, and you are basically allowed to take a card out of your hand if it matches the color or the number on the face-up card in the middle of the table. And then there's some specialty cards that affect the way the gameplay happens. You can reverse, you can skip people, you can make them draw cards. And the goal of the game is to get rid of all the cards in your hand. So on the surface, it's a pretty straightforward game. Deal some cards, look at your hand, play cards if you can play them, and just try to get rid of all your cards as fast as you can. But even with a game that's as straightforward as that, there's a lot of little sort of side tracks that happen. So if you're not familiar, I did throw the official Uno rules into our Blackboard. And even if you're someone who's played Uno, you might want to look at the rules, because I know a lot of people don't play Uno by the official rules. There are some ways that people over the years sort of bypass certain things. One of the things has to do with if you can't play a card and you have to draw cards from the draw pile. Some people play, you keep drawing until you draw a card you can play. And then you end up with the poor player that's got 36 cards in their hand and they can't hold them and all of this. The official rules actually just say draw a card, and if you can't play it, you move on to the next player. So if you're one of those that's always played the mean way of making people draw and draw and draw and draw, first of all, bless you, because that usually makes the game last forever. But it is actually not the official rules. So in any case, so the rules are all here. There is actually a scoring system for Uno, which I didn't even really know until I was doing this activity years ago. But more importantly, what I have here is an example of a flowchart for the game. I am using a piece of software online. It used to be called draw.io, draw.io, I guess people say it. They were acquired or bought out or somehow combined together with diagrams.net. And so now if you go to either draw.io or diagrams.net, it takes you to the same place. It's free. You don't even need a login. You don't even need to set up an account to use this. But it's a pretty decent flowchart creator. It's got a whole set of tools for different shapes. When you connect the shapes together with arrows and then you move the shapes, the arrows actually stay connected. If you've ever tried to do a flowchart in like Excel or Word or something, it gets really annoying because you move one square and then you have to redraw all your arrows because they no longer connect to each other. So in any case, if you or your group wants to use diagrams.net, just you can go there. You can save files to your local computer and then upload them again to work on them later. And like I said, you don't even need an account. It is completely open. You just log in and then you can go. So what I've done here is set up a flow chart for Uno. And I figured we could just kind of walk through it so you could see kind of what I did. Um, and this will then also maybe give you some ideas when you're creating yours about kind of what to look for and how to structure it and so on. So one thing I will say is that whatever your game setup is, and every game will have that, whether it's put the board on the table and give everybody 6 cards, right? You can put all of that into one box. You don't have to split out each of those steps into multiple boxes. So here I've got for this one, you shuffle the cards, you deal 7 cards to each player, you put the remaining cards face down, you turn 1 card face up, and then you set the play direction to clockwise, and you pick your first player. And actually, in the official Uno rules, it doesn't have. Sometimes they'll say like youngest player goes first, or player to the left of the dealer goes first. Uno, I think it just says select a player. So at that point now you are ready to play the game. So everything that goes into that opening kind of exists on its own, and I just decided to put that in a green box to kind of set it aside. So let's say now you are playing Uno, and even if you haven't played Uno, at this point you're sitting there with 7 cards in your hand, and there is 1 card face up in the middle of the table. So what is kind of the first what are you doing as a player, or what is the player doing at this moment to figure out what they're going to do next? Does anybody want to chime in with a thought? It's a decision that the player is having to make that has a sort of a yes and a no coming out of it. So you're sitting there looking at cards, you've got a face up card. What's the first question that you're asking yourself?
What card am I going to play?
Do any of my cards match that card?
There we go. Yeah. But yes. What card you're going to play, we're going to get there. But before that, you have to just figure out, do I even have a card that can physically be played? So does the current player currently have at least one wild card or a card that matches the color or type of the face-up card? So that is the way to test. And it says some version of this in the Uno rules because it tells you what are legal cards you can play at any given moment. So essentially, this is testing whether you as a player or any player has any legal cards that they can play. And in Uno, if you have a card that can be played, you must play it. You can't decide to hold on to a card. So it's really just a yes or no. So let's say that the answer is no. You look at your hand, you look at the card on the table, and there is nothing in your hand that you can play. So then there's another thing. Oh, I'm sorry. This is just wild cards. I was trying to think of what this next box is. So if there's no wild card or face or color or design, the next thing you have to think about is, do you have a wild draw 4? And that's like the king of all the cards in Uno, because that's where you really create problems for the next player. But you can't, by the rules, you can't play a wild draw 4 unless it's the only card you can play. That's another thing a lot of people don't realize about Uno. They think they can play them whenever, but according to the rules, you cannot play that card unless it is the only card you can play. So that takes us to this next step. if they do have the wild draw 4, then what has to happen? The player has to.
Draw 4 and they lose their turn.
Well, we're still talking about the current player. So if the current player has a wild draw 4 in their hand, they have to.
Choose what color is going to be.
Yeah, they have to play it. And then the next player draws 4 cards. And they lose a turn. If the current player does not have a, and then from there, and I think this is where what you just said comes in, current player selects a color of choice. All right, and that's the order it goes in. Is the next player has to pick their 4 cards, they lose a turn, and then the current player, the one who put the draw 4 down, says blue. And then once that happens, the next player becomes the current player. All right. And at that point, the arrow loops right back in and we start the cycle all over again. All right. So this is sort of the first example we have of a game turn loop. So we've accounted for the player didn't have any normal cards, but they did have a wild draw 4. So at that point, they have to play it. It's not a choice. You have to play it. And then the current player selects the next color. The next player in the direction of play becomes the current player. And then we loop all over again. If they don't have a wild draw 4, and this is what we were just talking about. So player doesn't have any card in their hand they can play, including wild draw 4, then they have to
Draw a card.
draw a card. 1 card. Don't keep drawing until you have a card you can play. All right. So that next player, or the current player, the one who can't play something, draws 1 card. Now, what happens when that player draws the card? What do they do when they see that card come off the pile? They have an option here. There is one more thing they have to think about.
Does the card they pick up match a card on the table?
Yes. Is it playable? Stephen, I get the sense you are our Uno expert here. Are you a competitive Uno player? Are you on the professional circuit?
I mean, not professional, no, Sunday pro.
So when you pick up that card, that player has the option. If the card can be played, then what they do is they play that card, right? They would be selecting it from eligible cards in their hand, but that is by definition at this point the only eligible card they have, so they have to play it. If they can't play it, this is where the flow chart would tell people to keep drawing, would tell them differently. Because once they've drawn that 1 card, if it can't be played, we're brought back over to our big master loop. The next player becomes the current player, and then the whole thing starts all over again. All right, so now we've completed 2 complete game loops. If we go all the way back to if they had something they could play, if the answer is yes, then we're led to here, which we just uncovered, which is now they have to choose which card to play. In this diagram, the yellow sort of oblongs, can anybody guess why I put them in yellow and in a different shape? What do those 2 things represent in this game?
Are those the meaningfully ambiguous decisions?
Ding, 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 ding. These are the 2 places. If you look at there's one more little layered on, but it's a kind of a duplicate. But these are the 2 main places in this game where these meaningfully ambiguous decisions happen. So when a player chooses a color to pass on, they do not know whether that's going to result in them winning or losing the game. A lot of times a player will pick a color that they know they've got in their hand, but by the time the play comes around to them again, it may be a different color, maybe a different number. They don't know. So you make your best guess. It does influence the outcome of the game, but you have no way of knowing when you make that decision if it's the right decision, the one that's going to lead to you winning. Same thing with when you select your card to play. If you've got 3 different cards in your hand, you can play any of them. And you might play one of them, and that leads the person next to you winning the game. You might play a different one, and you might end up winning the game. You don't know, but it is a decision that has to be made. So that's where that meaningfully ambiguous decision happens. All right. So the player has now picked a card. They've made their ambiguous decision. They've played the card. What is the important thing in the game of Uno that could potentially happen right at this moment? And it is literally like within a second of when this person puts their card down. There's a very important little blip that occurs in the game here.
How many cards does the player have left?
Yes. Basically, does the current player have 0 or 1 cards left in their hand? If they've got more than 1, the game just is going to continue on, right? But if the player has 0 cards in their hand, guess what? Game over. There's our end game. That's the only dead end in the whole diagram. And that is when it happens. Person has a card, they've picked it, they've played it. If there's nothing left in their hands, that takes us to the end of the game. If they have exactly 1 card left in their hand, something's got to happen at this moment. And it involves the name of the game.
They have to say Uno.
Yeah, somebody has to say Uno. So if the player says Uno, when they put that next to the last card down, they're good. The game goes to the next player. If no one says Uno, and this is why it's good to kind of hide your cards, and nobody knows you only have 1 card, then you kind of got away with it. If the next player starts their turn and nobody has said Uno, then you're okay. But that can be kind of hard to do because people are really paying attention to how many cards are left. If someone other than the player says Uno, then that person who forgot to say Uno has to draw 4 cards. They don't win the game, and the play goes back into our big loop and moves on to the next player. All right. So that takes us to our end game and also to one more loop. And then we've still got one more section here, and this has to do then with what was the card that was played. Because some cards in Uno have special, affect the game in special ways. So this big diamond down here basically has to do with all the conditions that happen for each individual type of card. So if it's just a regular old number card, the game just continues on. Nothing special happens. You just move on to the next player. But you have reverse cards. If a reverse happens, then you actually need to know whether you're dealing with only a 2-player game or more, because if there's 2 players, a reverse becomes a skip because you can't reverse with 2 players. You're only going back and forth. If there's more than 2 players, direction of the gameplay changes. And as you loop around the loop, the next player is the person in the other direction, and the direction of gameplay changes. Skip card does exactly what it says. The next player in the direction of play doesn't get to do their turn, and it jumps to the person after them. That person becomes the next active player. If it's a draw 2, then that next player has to draw 2, and they get skipped, and it moves on to the next player. And then we just have the wild card, and here's the other meaningfully ambiguous decision. Same thing as up here, but if you play the wild card, you have to choose what color the game is going to continue on in. All right. And that's the entire game. So if I zoom out here a little, I know it's going to get a little small, but if we kind of look at this from a from a bird's eye perspective, starting at the green, every box, every shape, every diamond in this whole diagram leads somewhere else, with the one exception of our game over, of our end game. And that's where the flow chart really comes in handy. If you've truly gone through and mapped out every kind of decision along the way, every instruction that the player has to follow, and you have no open loops except your end game, then you can be pretty sure that you've sort of accounted for every possibility in your game. Not 100% guarantee, but much closer than just writing a set of rules and just trying to think through them. So, everything that's in here, all the decisions that are made, all of the instructions, if I jump back here to the official Uno rules, all of those things are embedded in the rules. So setup is all there. The special cards here in text is like what happens with the draw two card. Next person has to draw two cards and they forfeit their turn. All right. Reverse card, reverses direction of play, so on. And there's something later on for special rules if you're playing with two players. Skip card. So all of that information that was on the flow chart is right here in the rules. When we get to the actual gameplay, player to the left of the dealer goes first. It goes clockwise to start, passing to the left. Match the top card on the discard pile by number, color, or word. So that's when the player examines their cards to see if they have eligible cards to play, and so on. They give you an example. And then it goes on from there. And then here's the little bit. Before playing your next to the last card, you must say Uno. If you don't say Uno and another player catches you, then they get to say Uno, and you have to draw 4 cards, and you lose the rest of that turn, and so on. So, and then going out, here's even the little bit. If you forget to say Uno, but nobody else catches you, then you're safe, and you can just kind of keep your mouth shut and keep going. And then, here's the last thing, in terms of finishing up the game, and so on. And then they have all the scoring, which is kind of secondary to all of this. And then here's rules for 2 players. So here's where the reverse becomes a skip, and so on, and those sorts of special cases. So just trying to make that connection between sort of everything that shows up in the flow chart is something that was contained in the rules. I didn't make anything up. I didn't try to interpret anything. Every box and diamond on here was something where I said, okay, let me go look at the rules and see what it tells me to do now. So as you map through it, just kind of ask yourself, okay, what is the current player doing now? What are they trying to decide? What do they have to do? Put that down, and then figure out all the possible outcomes from that moment of the game, and then just try to get these circles completed so that you can follow a path around and around until you get to whatever the end game is. All right. So questions about anything I did here with the flow chart? There are no hard and fast rules about like what shapes to use for what colors to use for what in your flow chart. I would just say be consistent and make it make sense to you. If you want to make a little like legend on the side that explains what each of the shapes or colors does or is about, you can do that. But generally, it's pretty self-explanatory, like what is happening. I decided to use diamonds wherever there was a decision or a splitting in the game. I used the yellow rectangles for those meaningfully ambiguous decisions. I used the red stop sign for the end game. But if you want to use different shapes or color code it differently or whatever, that's totally fine. It's more about the function of it than necessarily the look of it. And as I said, if you use Draw.io or diagrams.net, the nice thing is, if you move things around, you see if I move this box, the arrow coming out of it actually redraws itself and stays connected to the box. So it's kind of a nice program to know about in case you ever have to do charts or graphs or things like that. All right. Anything else I can talk about? Yeah, go ahead, Abby.
Do our flow charts have to have like that? I mean, there's quite a few different things. Can ours be a little more simple than that, or should they be kind of as complex as that? I don't know if that's a difficult
Well,
question to answer.
yeah, you want it to be complete. Like you want it to represent any thought, any decision, or any instruction that affects the way the game is played. And generally speaking, you don't want to put a bunch of different things in one box. It's better to split it out into like a few steps, even if there's no decisions to be made. But then that's clear. Like this happens, then this, then this. Even if they're just running through them. So I guess it should be as detailed as is needed. Don't just do like here's the game setup and then have one big box that says play the game and then the player with the most points wins. Like obviously that's an oversimplification. So it's not going to be that simple. But this is honestly for typical games, this is not that complex. It took me a
Maybe
little
I didn't. Complex maybe wasn't the right word. I mean, there's quite a few like different variables. Like there's a skip card, a reverse card, a draw two card. Like this happened.
right. Well, but in
Should that?
your game, you may not need all of that. Obviously, I mean
Okay.
that's specific to Uno because that's
Yeah.
the way they designed the game to have these different cards. But
Yeah.
obviously, if it's a different type of game, the rules may be much simpler. The gameplay might be much simpler. In which case,
That's more what I meant.
the diagram. No, okay. So if you're kind of asking like, do our games need to reach a certain level of complexity?
Yeah.
The answer is no. Like you all are designing for different age levels. You're designing for different subject areas, for different abilities.
Yep.
Obviously, a game composed for second graders is going to look very different in complexity than a game designed for college undergraduates, right? So it will scale to whatever it is. But I want the flowchart to be useful to you, and for it
Absolutely.
to be that, it should have a certain level of detail to it. But that will really kind of depend on the complexity of the game. But I'm not looking for a minimum complexity. I'm just looking that it has rules, that it's got competing agents, that it's got some meaningfully ambiguous decisions, even if it's only one that gets made over and over, and that it has an end game. So,
Perfect.
good question.
Thank you.
All right. So, in terms of the work going forward from this, I'm introducing all of this now, the discussion of the rules and the flowcharts and all that. But again, to circle back to the top of the class, the expectation is not that in 2 weeks when we alpha test, that you have a flowchart and a full set of rules ready to go, right? In 2 weeks, it's about more along the lines, I'm thinking of making a card game that talks about this topic and helps teach students how to do this. And generally speaking, the game will be something along these lines where they will do sort of this type of thing. But you are not expected to be presenting play by play all the rules and everything else. Because part of the point of the alpha test is to make sure that your sort of core premises are sound for your game, that you've kind of thought through, is this really the best kind of game to create for these students to achieve this instructional goal? And so you might find in 2 weeks when you're in your discussions and getting your alpha testing done, you might get a suggestion from someone that suddenly makes you go, oh, yeah, maybe a card game's not the best way to go with this. Maybe I should really be thinking about a board game. So I just don't want you to get too far down the road of details and specifics before you've really had a chance to kind of make sure you're really confident about the type of game you're creating and the direction you're going in. We have plenty of time in this course. Once we get past spring break, there's a bunch of weeks that are mainly just lab work weeks for you to just work on your game. So you will have plenty of time to get the rules, built out and get your flowchart made and get the game pieces made. I'd rather at this point that you take a little more time in the planning, design considerations rather than just jumping immediately into getting the game created. So it's here, and I want you thinking about it. I do want you between now and next time to be thinking about those game design type decisions. That is the kind of thing that would be good to share next time. What kind of a game are you looking to make? Is it perfect or imperfect? Who's competing against each other? Those decisions you should plan to have in place in 2 weeks, not the rules and the flow chart and the game pieces and things like that. All right. So beyond that, honestly, beyond just kind of starting to think about your game more and maybe put a couple of things more down in your wiki, there is a forum for us to work through over the course of the next week, actually, probably the next couple of weeks. And in this one, now that you are actually starting to create a game that is educational, I would like you to think about or try to come up with an educational game that you have had an experience with, either as a student or as a teacher. Um, and I just want you to do a little sort of quick analysis of that game to get you thinking about the exact same things that you're going to be thinking about with your game. So, once you've picked the game, and this can be a digital game, it can be some online game, it could be a physical game, card game, board game, whatever, as long as it's sort of presented as some kind of an educational game, something that's supposed to be used in a classroom. So you're going to just give a brief description of the game. You don't have to describe every rule of the game and every bit of gameplay. Just give us an overview of what the game is. Can you tell what the instructional goals are for the game? Like looking at the game or from your experience with it, like what are the students supposed to be able to know or do once they get done playing the game? You might start finding that some things that are billed as educational games don't really look like they've got any educational goals in mind. I don't know. This would be a good thing to find out. Along those lines, how were those goals, if you can figure out what the goals are, how were they embedded in the game? How did the designers of the game lead the students through instruction at the same time that they were being led through the game? How were those two things brought together? Um, Impact on design. If the game is designed to be instructional, what choices do you see that the designers made to support that instructional goal? And this goes to things that we were talking about. Like, do you think they chose to make a board game because they were trying to achieve this educationally? Or did they make the game repetitive because they wanted it to be able to be played by a certain group of students? That kind of a thing. Um, and maybe going back to something earlier, do you actually think in the end that what you've chosen is actually meets the definition of a game? I will tell you right now, and unfortunately this means you can't use it, but we've already used it as an example, but Kahoot usually comes up as a game for the classroom. It actually does not meet the definition of a game. So even though people think it's a game, they call it a game, and they say it's an instructional or an educational game, it's more of a gamified activity than a game. So after you've looked at your game, you may come to the conclusion that actually, in truth, this isn't much of a game. And that's okay too. You don't have to keep searching for something that's actually a game. Just look for something that is said to be a game. And now that you know what you may decide differently. So once you've kind of done your write-up of those, covering those 5 things, this is what, maybe a paragraph or two. Then there's the actual forum itself, and you'll just create a new thread. maybe put the name of the game. I didn't say this in the instructions. Put the name of the game in the thread title. That way, as people are looking through, they might see a game that they've used, and they might be interested in like chiming in with some thoughts about that game if it's something that they've used as well. All right, so that's really kind of it. Again, we are transitioning now from kind of the analysis and goal setting phase to now actually figuring out how we're going to execute this game, how we're going to pull it off, what it's going to look like, and so on. So you've got a couple of weeks to let these ideas percolate. Alpha testing next time, where you'll get some direct and immediate feedback on your ideas. And then after that, you should feel pretty good about really jumping into the actual rule development and the flow chart, because hopefully you'll feel pretty good about what you've chosen and how you're planning to get there. Yeah, and then final thing, just again, next week will be our final of our 3 Scratch weeks, and we'll be going through just a couple more chunks of codes, and there will be one more mini project. And then the final Scratch project, and part of the reason I'm kind of timing these things out this way, your final Scratch project ideally should be something connected to the game you're creating. I mean, since you're going to have to create a digital element for your game anyway, you may as well kill 2 birds with 1 stone and have that project also be the thing that you're making for your game. So, we'll talk a little bit more about what that is and what the guidelines are. But once we get through next week, that'll wrap it up in terms of instructional work for Scratch. Then it'll just be looking at how to incorporate Scratch into your game in some small way through some game material. There's one of, oh, I meant to say this at the beginning of class. My goal for myself over the course of the next week, between now and a week from now, is to get caught up on grading. I know a lot of you've all been really good about getting the forum posts in, the Scratch mini projects. It looks like we're in really good shape there. So my goal this week is to work my way through all of that and get grades and feedback and so on put into Blackboard for whatever's been turned in so far. Mainly the feedback will be on the Scratch projects, the mini projects, and honestly on them, if everything functions the way it's supposed to function, I probably won't have much to say other than looks good, everything works well. If I do come across something where something's not functioning the way that it should, I will note that in Blackboard in my comments on the assignment. But generally speaking, on the mini projects, I'm not going to go through and analyze everything you do, because for the most part, if it works the way it's supposed to work, then you've shown me what you need to show me, and it's all good at that point. So, but my goal is to be caught up by a week from now with at least anything that's been turned in so far. Okay. Anything else for the good of the order before we head our merry ways for the evening? All right. Well, I will take that to mean that we feel we're in pretty good shape. Reach out with questions, concerns as we go through the next week or so. And next week is Scratch in person. The following week is alpha testing, and that will be asynchronous. That'll be one of the weeks where I'm meeting with 5:30 on Tuesday. So we will not meet in 5:20 on the alpha testing week. That will be an activity that you do independently through Blackboard. All right. Thank you all. Have a great evening. I'll hang out here till everyone's on their way. Have a good week.